At the hospital, shy woman walked into the wrong recovery room, and the CEO called her "my wife." The rain hadn't stopped all morning. It tapped against the hospital's glass walls like 1,000 tiny clocks, each tick echoing the anxious heartbeat of Lila Hayes. She stood in the lobby clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. Her shoes were damp from the puddles outside, her sweater clinging to her from the walk across the parking lot. She wasn't here for herself. She never was. Lila was here for her neighbor, Mrs. June Callahan, an 82-year-old widow who had nobody else to take her to surgery today. Mrs. June's children lived halfway across the country and hadn't called in years. Lila had offered without hesitation, even though hospitals made her nervous. Shy by nature, she wasn't the kind to start conversations or step into unfamiliar places. But she was the kind who noticed when someone needed help, even if it meant stepping out of her own comfort zone. Now, hours after Mrs. June had been wheeled into surgery, the waiting room felt too still. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the clock's steady ticking made her more restless. She needed to stretch her legs. When the nurse finally emerged, mask pulled down to her chin, she smiled. "Mrs. Hayes. You can see her now. Recovery room 12. Lila blinked. "Mrs. Hayes." She almost corrected her, but then remembered, Mrs. June sometimes used her name for paperwork when she couldn't remember things. It was probably just a mix-up. She followed the nurse down a long hallway. Her shoes squeaked softly against the polished floors. They passed rooms with open curtains, patients resting quietly, machines humming beside them. When they reached room 12, the curtain was drawn halfway. Lila stepped in slowly, bracing herself to see Mrs. June groggy and pale. But the man lying in the bed was definitely not Mrs. June. He was tall, even lying down, his shoulders broad under the hospital gown. His dark hair was mussed, his jaw shadowed with stubble. There was an IV drip beside him, and his left arm was wrapped in a fresh bandage. He looked like someone you'd see in a magazine ad, except his skin was pale from surgery and his expression softened the moment his eyes met hers. And then he said it. "My wife," he whispered hoarsely, a small smile tugging at his lips. Lila froze. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone else behind her. The man's smile deepened, though his eyelids fluttered like he was fighting to stay awake. "You came." "I think," Lila started, but stopped. Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't just relief. It was the kind of aching gratitude you heard from someone who had been afraid they'd be alone. The nurse, still holding the chart, gave her an apologetic glance. "I'll give you two a moment," she murmured, and slipped away. Lila stood there, torn. She could correct the mistake right now. But the man looked so fragile. There was a loneliness in his eyes that tugged at something deep in her. She stepped closer. "I think you've mistaken me for." "Don't," he said softly, almost pleading. "Just stay a minute." And against every shy, rule-following instinct in her, she did. He told her, in bits and pieces between slow breaths, that his name was Ethan Caldwell. That he'd been in the hospital after a minor car accident that turned unexpectedly serious when they found internal bleeding. That he had been alone through it all, because his real wife, apparently, had left months ago. She said I didn't have time for her anymore, he murmured, eyes unfocused. Said I was married to my job. "What do you do?" Lila asked quietly, not sure why she was indulging this strange conversation. Ethan's lips curved faintly. "Run a company." "What kind?" "The kind where you're on call 24/7 and forget what day it is," he said. "The kind that makes you forget who you are when you're not working." It wasn't until later, much later, that she'd learned company meant a multinational conglomerate, and that run meant he was the CEO. But right now, he was just a man in a hospital bed, looking at her like she was the only steady thing in his blurred world. She sat in the chair beside him, unsure why she couldn't bring herself to leave. Maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be invisible. When she finally excused herself, saying she had to check on Mrs. June, Ethan's hand reached out and gently caught her wrist. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. His voice was tentative, like he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. She hesitated. I'm not. Please." The word was so quiet it almost broke her. She nodded. Just for a little while. The days that followed were nothing Lila could have predicted. Every morning, after making sure Mrs. June was recovering well in her room, she'd find herself drifting toward room 12. Ethan would be sitting up a little more each day, asking her about her life in that unhurried way of someone who actually listened. She told him about her job as a part-time librarian, about her love for old books and rainy afternoons, about how she had lost her parents young and learned to keep to herself because she never wanted to be a burden to anyone. He told her about a childhood spent trying to impress a father who was never satisfied, about how success had filled his bank account but emptied his life, about how the silence in his penthouse sometimes felt heavier than the noise of the busiest boardroom. Somewhere between those conversations, the boundaries blurred. They weren't patient and visitor anymore. They were two people who understood loneliness in its different shapes. But it wasn't all quiet moments. There was the day a board member stormed into the hospital room with a stack of contracts for Ethan to sign, ignoring the four and the monitors. Lila, normally too shy to speak up, stepped in front of the bed and said firmly, "He's not signing anything until he's cleared by his doctor." The man blinked at her, startled. Ethan just stared at her like she'd done something extraordinary. Later, he told her no one had defended him like that in years. There was also the night Ethan woke up in pain, the nurse busy elsewhere, and Lila, who had been reading in the corner, jumped up to steady him and hold his hand until the worst passed. "You make it hurt less," he whispered when it was over. And though she told herself it was just the medication talking, her heart didn't quite believe it. The turning point came on the 5th day. Ethan's condition had improved enough that he could be discharged soon, and Lila knew her visits were about to end. She was walking toward Mrs. June's room when she overheard two nurses whispering. "That's him, Ethan Caldwell, the CEO of Caldwell Global." "Yeah, and get this," he told Dar Benson yesterday that the shy lady who visits him is his wife. Lila froze. When she walked into room 12, Ethan looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "You heard," he said. She crossed her arms. "Why would you say that?" "Because," he said simply, "when you walked in that first day, I thought I was dreaming. I thought maybe I'd woken up in a life where I'd made different choices. Where the woman waiting for me actually wanted to be there. I didn't want to let that feeling go." Her throat tightened. "Ethan, I'm not." "I know," he said. "And I'm not asking you to be. I just needed you to know that you've been the best thing about this hospital." On his last day, he thanked her for every visit, every conversation, every quiet moment. She thought that was it, that they'd go back to separate lives. But a week later, she found a letter slipped under her apartment door. "Lila. In my world, people show up when they need something. You showed up when you didn't have to. You reminded me of who I want to be outside of my title. I'd like to see you again, not in a hospital room, and not because either of us need saving. Just two people who want to be there. Ethan." She smiled, the rain tapping against her window like it had that first day. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like stepping out into it.